I'm Silvia Pavoni, economics editor of The Banker, and I'm joined by Henrique Meirelles, the finance minister of Brazil. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to exchange some ideas with you.
Wonderful. We are in London. You've spent the whole day talking to potential investors, and you've done the same in Brussels and New York, telling them about the growth opportunities of Brazil. But I'm sure there have been a number of questions about the reform package and whether the government will be able to balance its books. And it may be that none of these might be achieved by the end of the year.
Well, first, a good part of the reforms were already completed. First one, the very important and basic first step, which was the cap on the growth of government spending, it's already approved. It's part of the Constitution that was approved last December, actually.
But the pensions reform, which is the big one, the very ambitious and much needed one, that's still missing.
There was another very ambitious one, which was the labor reform, which was already approved. In summary, the reforms are moving forward, and now we have the vote on Social Security, which our expectation is that it's going to be approved. And we have to see. The vote is going to take place within the next month or so. And I think it's the good timing. The number of votes that we keep hearing or reading, etc., I think is a little bit premature, because when we come to the actual discussion of the reform and the actual negotiations, etc., we'll see. My expectation, again, is that it should be approved.
Okay, so you're hopeful that actually the complete package, including the pensions reform, will be approved by the end of the year?
I think so, yes.
Okay. What about balancing the books? So it looks like the government will end 2017 with a deficit of around 3%. No escaping from that.
Yes, we have a budget planned with this deficit this year, and next year about the same, maybe a little bit lower because GDP should be slightly higher, and then start to decline and become surplus. And then after that, it's going to become a surplus actually larger and larger, and the idea is actually how to do with that in the future. But that's another subject. The key point is that with the ceiling on expenses and with the fact that GDP growth rate is already on the way, and that means that tax revenues will grow, and actually the correlation in the last years show that when GDP grows, the tax collections grow somewhat more. And actually the same thing when GDP is contracting. And that means that we would have a strong recovery of tax collection if indeed, which is the case, GDP grows at a higher rate than 2% next year. That with the ceiling on the deficit, that means that the fiscal result will improve substantially, and actually some analysts who look ahead are beginning to wonder how next governments will deal with larger and larger surpluses ahead.
Okay, so that's a nice problem to have.
Absolutely.
Okay, you mentioned the next government, so I'm going to jump right into politics. Brazil is going to have presidential elections next year in 2018, and it seems like the far right and left are becoming more popular. Yes. How concerned are you about this? And of course, we should also mention that your name has also been thrown into the potential candidates.
Well, I think that what's taking place is only a natural development. Number one, the left, which is basically the Workers' Party, it basically in the polls is showing to have the same kind of share which has had over the last decades. I mean, that's the traditional voter for that party, their constituency, which then there's no surprise there, it's expected. When they lost elections several times, or when they won the election. They started basically with that, unless, for instance, when the second election for President Lula, re-election, or when they elected President Dilma, then he had a very high ratio. But normally when they are in the opposition, that's the kind of rate they have.
And of course, the candidates of the far left, or of the left, is former President Lula, who is fighting corruption charges as well.
Exactly. And then, on the other hand, you have on the right new factor, yes, but that's also a natural development of what you've just mentioned. After so many years of having left in power, about 13 years, and with all those charges and allegations and corruption, and the fact that when they left government, there was a very deep recession in the country, very high unemployment, and all of that together, it's only natural that as one of the developments, not the only one of the development, you have another extreme rising, which is the extreme right, which that's new in Brazil.
That's new and potentially alarming, considering also that the current government's approval ratings are so low, around 5%, and that the current president, Michel Temer, is also fighting corruption charges.
Yeah, the natural aspect of that is, number one, the way I understand the low approval rate of the president is, first, he was not elected because he took over as a result of the impeachment process. Number two, he is being responsible for a series of very important reforms, but unpopular. The Social Security, people don't like that because they would have to.
Of course, it affects directly the pocket. So the markets are more enthusiastic about the prospects of these reforms, while voters.
Yes, but not labor reform, even worse. And this and that. But the point is that exactly because he had a short period, he made the decision that he do what's necessary to do for Brazil, which is overdue for decades. Do that now because he's not running for re-election anyway. And then that's, I think, is going the way it would be expected. And if you take the two extremes, evidently there is an ample room here in the center, which there are several candidates who are positioning themselves for that.
And perhaps is that where you might also position yourself, if you were to?
Well, I am not thinking about that at the moment.
Okay.
I am focused on my work as finance minister. I think that with all those reforms going on, and with the recovery of the economy taking place, I think that I have to be fully dedicated to that with 100% of my attention on the economic recovery of the country. Next year, I will think about the future.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the economic recovery, a timid recovery, but at least the country looks now out of recession, and there are some other hopeful economic indicators such as low inflation, which may stay under 3% for the end of the year, and also a low interest rate, the Selic, the benchmark rate. So what will this mean for the development of Brazil's capital markets, which until now have remained quite shallow?
I think that that's very positive, number one, because with the level of interest rates that has prevailed in Brazil for so many years, it's difficult to develop a capital market. But more important even than that is the predictability. The moment that we complete this set of reforms, what is beginning to happen is that markets beginning to look long-term. Why? Because then we can project for instance, the state debt, the profile of the public debt over the next decade. We have a ceiling on the growth of government expenses now, which is in the Constitution valued for 10 years. With the labor reform, with all of that having taken place, what we have now is a much more predictable environment, because the roots of the instability of the Brazilian economy in the last decades was exactly on the fiscal side of the economy. Because if you take, for instance, the total amount of federal expenses as a percentage of the GDP in 1991 was 10.8%. In 2016, 19.8%. A straight line ahead, obviously unsustainable. With that kind of route, what happens? When the markets are very positive, etc., things go well. Any problem, either in Brazil or outside Brazil, if the markets turn sour, what happens in a situation like that? We have a crisis. We had several fiscal crises over this time. Then, what's happening now? The moment that we address this basic problem, we will have more predictability. As a result of that, capital markets, I think, will prosper.
So a better managed economy will lead to deeper and more interesting and livelier capital markets as well.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you so much, Minister Meirelles.
Welcome, my pleasure. Thank you.